If you're not already subscribed to this YouTube channel, go ahead and hit the subscribe button now, along with the bell icon so you can be notified whenever a new video is posted. And if you're already subscribed, check and make sure that YouTube hasn't unsubscribed you. And of course, be sure to give the video a like as well as share it on your social media. The white supremacists hate that. And now, the Sunday address. You know as well as I do that the bootlicks and shills have been doing a lot of finger wagging at us as of late, and the reason why is what they're seeing is that the stance that the black grassroots have taken hasn't been some flash in the pan. It hasn't been some one and done. We have actually dug in our heels, and what we've been saying here online has been spreading offline, and that's got them mad. Well, let me tell you something. These guys are not going to be changing their disposition towards us simply because we have finally stood up for ourselves. The reason that they dislike us is because they always have. Hatred of black Americans, specifically those of us who came out of slavery in this country, has been part of the American fabric from day one. This country has two cardinal sins. The first, of course, is the enslavement, dehumanization, and nonstop barbarism against foundational black Americans that continues all the way to the present. The second cardinal sin, closely related to the first, is hypocrisy. This country was built on lies. We ought to know everything they've ever said about us, and all the things that they refuse to say have been lies. Now, the reason for this evening's address, why they hate us, isn't for the reason that a lot of you might think. This is not some emotional self-reflection of, oh, why is it that they're always dumping on us? Quite the opposite, believe it or not. It's actually the opposite of an American propaganda film from the 1940s. In 1942, right after the U.S. entered the Second World War, the War Department had commissioned a filmmaker named Frank Capra to make a propaganda film for the war effort called Why We Fight. Basically, it gave a summary of the events leading up to the Second World War because there was no television back then. Radio was very limited, and although there were newspapers and magazines, most people back then didn't read all of them, certainly not the ones about politics, and literacy back then was lower than it is today, believe it or not. So, the movie theaters were where you pretty much got your news from. The propaganda flick the War Department commissioned explained the rise of the Nazis mostly, though it gave some minor explanation of Imperial Japan and Fascist Italy's wrongdoings as well. Now, the overwhelming theme of that propaganda film was that the Axis powers were going to snuff out the so-called Lighthouse of Liberty in the U.S., and the Nazis' morality and values were diametrically opposed to that of the good, honest, kind-hearted United States, and that's why we fight. Well, as black Americans know all too well, the U.S. actually inspired Nazi Germany, not the other way around. German politicians and social scientists had visited the U.S. in the 19th and early 20th centuries, and they observed segregation and Jim Crow in the American South and how the U.S. government backed it every step of the way, from the legislatures to the judiciary and in every aspect of daily life. These German observers took what they saw in the United States as a model for how they could handle the Jews in Germany. Every doctrine and practice of pointing out racial inferiority had been created and perfected in the U.S. against black Americans long before Adolf Hitler was even born. The United States was who the Nazis modeled themselves after, so the values of America and Hitler overlap. In fact, Hitler was the one who took his values from the United States. The only so-called value that didn't overlap was who they thought would get what slice of the pie, the same savage debate that has always splintered the Europeans no matter where they live. Now, part of the propaganda film from the 40s gave a brief summary of America's different ethnic groups, talking about how everybody's making the contribution to building America. It was a bunch of feel-good gibberish. They mentioned everybody you would think. They mentioned the Polish, the Chinese, the Swedes, the Germans, etc., but they didn't mention black folks until like the very end of their little list. Now, ain't that something? Asians were only a small handful of the population back then as they are today, and yet they made sure to mention Asians before they mentioned black people. This flick had black people as just picking cotton, and apparently that's the only contribution black people have made, right? Everybody else were farmers and whatnot, and black folks just picking cotton, that's all. The second largest racial group in the country, and they decide that black folks are going to be given a one-and-done mention after everybody else. But then again, they have to downplay black people, because to mention what they'd done to black Americans would show the blatant contradiction and lies the U.S. government was trying to promote. You can't demonize the Nazis and justify fighting them when the U.S. has been doing the exact same thing. Everything you would say about how the Jews were treated in Germany, you could say many times over about Black Americans in the US, but of course, you can't actually say it. But the question that must be asked, and that we have to force these anti-Black racists to answer, is that if the United States was justified in jumping into a war in Europe because of the treatment of Germany against its own citizens, then how much more justified would Black Americans be to fight in the United States about the treatment we've been subjected to here? Anyone going to put out any films from the Department of Defense saying, well, Black Americans are justified because of the history of how this country has treated us? Oh, no, of course not. Everyone else is justified in fighting back when they're wronged, and the United States has a right to jump into fights that have nothing to do with it if it's in their interest, so long as Black people are not benefiting. But Black people right here in the United States pointing out the blatant hypocrisy and racism and brutality and deciding we're going to stop it, oh, well, that we cannot have. But how are we going to fight back when too many of us have already been conditioned to not even talk back? We have to fight. But let's be bluntly honest here. Fighting is hard, especially when people have become complacent or apathetic. People won't fight if they think, or in our case have been fooled into thinking, someone else is going to do all their fighting for them. This is where the misconception about voting comes in. Voting can be a valid and useful tool for your empowerment, but only if the individuals that you're trying to put into government have made up their minds they're going to fight on your behalf. Talking won't do. Individuals telling you about chess moves and telling you sit on your hands and just trust them to do something, that won't do. You need people who are going to go in there and fight, and fighting means that they're going to be making a mess. But even the people that you install are not going to do anything if they think that you will not hold them accountable and punish them should they fail to do what you told them to do. This is the reason why I don't like the Orange Man, certainly don't like that gallery of rogues that he surrounds himself with. But the reality is, Trump and the bigots that he has around him, these guys are a symptom of the problem. The actual problem happens to be that a critical mass of Black folks decided to allow our morality and our fire that we got in the belly to go to sleep. We decided that we were going to sit back and try to farm out our fighting to people who are not representing our interests at all. And until we change that posture, nothing else is going to. So as far as I'm concerned, let the Orange Man and the rest of his racist pals run wild for a while because it's going to get people off their butts. Now that may be an unpleasant reality, but it is the reality. When the Orange Man was in office before, people couldn't deny the fact that there was an unrepentant racist in the White House, and that made it where they had to get off their butts to fight him and to fight his pals. And what happened when people rose up? What happened was the bad guys backed down. That's what happened. That's the reality. The sad truth is that a majority of us need to have our backs put to the wall so that we will fight our way out of it. It's like I've been telling you ever since RIP Black America. When we fight, we win. That's something that all of these shills and tethers and bootlicks and con men, they don't want you to know. They want you to think, no. You got to sit back and see if the Democrats are going to do it, or see if some good group of white liberals will do it, or maybe some black bootlicks who are being paid by white dark money groups. Let them fight, but they never fight at all. You've had these professional sock puppet organizations like the NAACP, the National Action Network, NCOBRA. All these clowns got N at the beginning of their names. And I think N stands for nitwits. And these fools have been out there since the beginning of time. And none of our interests have been front and center. Nobody was saying a word about reparations until the black media put it on the map. And when we did, what happened was all of these little bootlick organizations started fighting us. You didn't have any of them who came forward and said, you know what? Now the reparations finally being talked about. Let's go ahead and put these Democrat politicians on the spot. Let's extract promises from them. Instead, you had Big Bird from NCOBRA who was trying to brag that we're the longest standing reparations group in America. Ain't done a goddamn thing in 40-something years. He brings Kamala Harris on his little sideshow. And what does he do? He just sits there and allows her to deliver her stump speech. She gives the same old stale talking points that she had been giving for the last couple of years. And he sits there and nods his head as if she said something profound and meaningful when she said the same canned gibberish that she'd been saying for years. He doesn't press her on reparations, doesn't demand anything specific. As far as he's concerned, she's on the show and we're going to go ahead and vote for Sister Girl. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And of course, as I documented for you, Big Bird was also the bootlick on the scene when you had those two Tennessee legislators who pulled their little attention stunt all about gun control. But not a word about reparations. Yeah, they know exactly what it is the Democrats want them to say. That's the reason why you got people like Gavin Newsom and others who are trying to go ahead and tiptoe away from the Democrats who are making demands on. When Gavin Newsom's sitting there saying that the Democrats need to start moving away from trans rights, that's fine by me. My problem is he's not saying, you know what, these black voters over here, they're the ones who put us in office. We've been losing the black vote for at least a decade now. The numbers have been trending in the wrong direction, and we got to fix that. But then again, why would Gavin Newsom do that? As the black media has explained to you, he was the one who worked to deep six the reparations bill out in California. So Gavin Newsom, he's basically in the same bed as freaking Rahm Emanuel. That's what's going on here. You got all these Democrats who are being forced to put their cards on the table and show where they've always stood. And this is a good thing because black people have had the blinders on for the longest time, trying to imagine that these Democrats were supposed to be on our side when the reality is they're not. And now what's happened is that they're being forced to actually show who and what they are. And black people are not going to be able to sit here any longer and say, well, I mean, they gonna do what they say. I mean, they knows what'll happen if they don't, so they gonna go ahead. No, you can't play that game of hiding your head in the sand anymore. We are going to have to fight, and the Democrats are going to be on the list of people that we're fighting against. They've been fighting us the whole time. The problem is we haven't been fighting back. And that's the reason why I say with these anti-black racists, they're going to need to catch more than a political bloody nose. They're going to have to get a general principle butt whipping. Put on the steel toe boots and let them things start swinging. That's what has to happen next. There has only been one group and one group only who has been fighting against the racialist pyramid scheme that this country is. And that happens to be foundational black Americans with a number of, to be mentioned, people from the diaspora. But the truth of the matter is, by and large, the ones who came from outside this country, too many of them were on the get along to go along train, and that don't work. This is the reason why they got problems with this. Starting in the 20th century, when you had the advent of movies, you had some black folks who were out there, but if you look at a number of those films, you'll see that many of those people were basically from outside the U.S., even Sidney Poitier. They were trying to find people who, can we find somebody who's like Afro-Latino or something? Why, no, these guys, they just make us a little bit disturbed. Yeah, because when they look at us, what they see is the undeniable justice that we represent. They see the legitimacy that we have morally, and they see their own moral illegitimacy. That's the reason why they hate us. You can't be out here promoting an image to the world of how you're the good guys and you're on the side of the angels when we are the living proof that you're on the side of the devil himself. That's why they hate us. They hate us because they could not break us. Hundreds of years, they were able to do that in other countries. Didn't take anywhere near that long. All these other countries around the world, they've been successfully able to walk in there, and all these other folks, they couldn't wait to get on their knees to start bowing and scraping and singing the praises of white supremacy. They could not wait because they thought that was the way to go. We alone stuck to our guns because we have that unshakable moral core. That is what makes us who we are. Whenever anybody thinks about anything that's good or decent or moral about America, they can only point to the things that we brought into being. All of the racism, all of the bigotry, the hate crimes, all of the enmity and religious strife that came from the dominant society. And it didn't matter if it was the ones who came over on the Mayflower or their kinfolk who showed up later. It was always the same game over and over again. And when it came time to talk about what good came out of America, they couldn't point to themselves. They could only point to us. And that makes them furious because they want the story to be all about themselves. When there's something that the white supremacists want, they'll take all the help they can get, but then they want to turn around afterwards and take all the credit too. But with us, they can't do that. That's the reason why we cannot allow people to appropriate our history. We can't allow culture vultures. We can't allow anybody to bring in anybody else and say, we had something to do with this or that. No, you were not even in the room. We have got to take a hard-nosed approach to that. You look at literally every other group that the white supremacists have encountered. They successfully made all these other groups want to be them. And that also sadly includes the majority, not all, but the vast majority of the Africans and the Caribbeans. They went along with it too. And since we are the only ones who have actually been fighting and resisting white supremacy in the very belly of the beast, they hate the fact that we set the example that everybody else looks at. Because all these other groups, they love to play along with white supremacy until the white supremacists decide to put their foots up their behinds. Then all of a sudden, well, we need to reach back to Dr. King and the civil rights and the Frederick Douglass. No, that's our history, not yours. You guys said that there was no racism. You guys said that America's a pure meritocracy. Racism was in the past. So don't go complaining about it now. See, everybody else idolizes these white supremacists. Can't wait to lick their boots and look up to them. But we alone, The lowest strata of the society, even from our low position, we still have the ability to look down on these white supremacists. And they hate it. What's that old saying? You always want most what you can't have? They've stolen all the wealth that we generated, but even so, they still desperately want what money can't buy. Moral legitimacy. They want the moral legitimacy that we have, and they know they can only get it if we choose to bestow it on them. That's the real reason why, from Abraham Lincoln using Frederick Douglass as an ambassador, to President Truman using black figures like Walter White and Ralph Bunche to legitimize the establishment of Israel, to providing a phony counter-narrative of a melting pot to Soviet propaganda, the U.S. has always pushed us out front to make itself look clean when the dominant society is dirty as hell. They can't speak with authority because they can't speak with morality, and they hate the fact that the world can see it. During the 2020 uprisings, the Trump administration and even a number of Democrats were trying to wag their fingers at China over China's crackdown on protesters in Hong Kong. The Chinese government itself went on Twitter and they posted a tweet saying, "I can't breathe." They were directly showing the world that it was the treatment of black Americans that erased any phony moralizing the U.S. may try to do. And that infuriated these white supremacists because it meant that the road to moral legitimacy runs straight through the black community, and it doesn't run through the dominant society. That verified their immorality to the world. That's how the world sees them, no matter how they try to aggrandize themselves with their movies and TV shows. Yeah, people may buy skin whitening cream, but at the end of the day, when you put all of those cosmetics aside, black is where it's at. And you see, we're supposed to be seen as irrelevant. We're not supposed to matter at all. And when the world points to us as the evidence that these white supremacists are immoral, it proves to them that the world sees them the same way we do. That's the reason why you got all these Republicans running around writing laws that are criminalizing history books and criminalizing calling them the racists that they are, and you got Democrats going right along with it. But there's also another side to them wanting what they can't have. They want us to do what everyone else has done and say, "Massa, we want to be you." But we refuse to. They need us to legitimize them, to give them our blessing. But we tell them time and again, you can't have it. And that infuriates them, because power is about taking what you want. You shouldn't have to ask the most powerless people in the society for anything. They shouldn't be able to withhold anything. In our case, we're making them beg. They tell themselves how powerful they are, but we prove that they're weak. They can't even persuade, trick, or coerce us into idolizing them. And this goes for these bootlicks, shills, tethers, and anti-black racists from abroad, too. They also know all of their self-made nonsense is a lie, but they want to graft themselves onto the tree of white supremacy, and they know since at least the 19th century that the way to get in good with the dominant society is to show that you're fully on board with anti-black racism, that you will work to reinforce and sustain the racial pyramid. So when we tell them that they're going to wind up getting crushed by the very white supremacists that they're buddying up with, that infuriates them. And that goes to the very heart of why all of these groups are so hostile towards us. What they hate most is that they know we're right. They obsess over us because they can't stop thinking about how everything we say about them is true. They resent the fact that they want to tell themselves they're better than us, and yet they take all of their moral, cultural, and historical cues from us. They cannot find a way to legitimize themselves without referencing us, and that infuriates them. They've told themselves that they're omnipotent. We prove that they're not. They tell themselves they're moral. We prove they are not. They built a house of lies, and we alone have had the courage to call that house of lies a house of cards. They claim to be the genetically superior, and yet we can annihilate them merely if we make the mistake of hopping in the bed with one of these racists. They claim not to be bigots at all. We prove that they are, to the point that they have to admit it. They didn't break us. We broke them. They never forced us to say that they're God, but we forced them to admit they're the devil. With some of these meth-head morons and fentanyl freaks running around, it's easy to see how many are bemoaning their own obsolescence. White supremacy is about situational ethics and moral relativism. What they claim to believe or think changes on the moment based on whether they think it will advantage them or not. Black empowerment, on the other hand, stands strong, unchanging, because justice doesn't change. It's always right. And so are we. And they know it. And that's the reason they hate us. Our presence is a perpetual reminder to them that they are not what they claim to be. And so long as we continue to stand on our square, so long as we decide that we're going to fight and continue to fight, to actually fight, then we are also going to prove that we are exactly who and what we claim to be. The end of white supremacy, the end of their system of goodies, giveaways, and guarantees that they're completely dependent on, and the beginning of justice. Good evening, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors. BC, Sean, Nora Brown, Deborah Ware, and Brenda Starr. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.